In a newly excavated room in Pompeii's Regio V, the walls are blue. This is not the faded blue-gray of weathered plaster or the accidental hue of age, but a deliberate and costly blue. A room painted to stand apart from the ordinary surfaces around it. Set into the walls are red niches, likely connected with offerings. Female figures appear in the decoration, while amphorae and construction materials were found there as well. The room was not isolated. It belonged to a private domus in Insula 10, part of a larger domestic complex containing a courtyard, a staircase, an elaborate dining room known as the Black Room, and a private thermal bath complex.
This is not the Pompeii most people first imagine. The familiar Pompeii is a city stopped by catastrophe. Streets were buried, houses sealed, and bodies caught in the final violence of the eruption. It is often described as frozen in time, and there is a real truth to that phrase. Pompeii remains extraordinary because so much survived. But the Blue Room shows that the reality is not quite so simple. The room was preserved, but it was also disturbed. Later tunnels breached the space, damaging its mosaic floor. Some of what was once here may no longer remain, and the meaning of the room is still being worked out through excavation, conservation, pigment analysis, and context. Pompeii, then, is not finished simply because it was buried. It is not a book that only needs to be opened, but an archaeological record. Material, damaged, layered, and still being read. The Regio V Domus is a good place to begin because it does not fit the simple modern image of a Roman house. In our modern imagination, a house is usually private, a place where ordinary life happens away from the public world. But a wealthy Pompeian home could be much more complicated than that. Rooms could display status, walls could create atmosphere, and courtyards could organize movement. Dining spaces could receive guests, while storage vessels, construction materials, staircases, service zones, and decoration could all belong to the same domestic environment. The house was not just a place where people lived, it was a place where relationships were arranged through physical space. The Blue Room helps reveal this because it is both intimate and outward-facing in what it implies. Its blue pigment was not a neutral background. Analysis has identified the extensive use of Egyptian blue, a material choice that required labor, knowledge, and expense. Its red niches suggest ritual use, while its figures and painted surfaces show an effort to make the room meaningful, not merely functional. But the same room also contained amphorae and construction materials. That detail matters. It keeps the space from becoming a frozen stage set. Even a highly decorated domestic room could be part of a changing household, a place undergoing use, alteration, storage, repair, or preparation. A room like this does not simply say, "This is how Romans lived." It asks a more difficult question. What kind of household produced this exact combination of display, ritual, work, and interruption? Nearby, in the same domestic complex, another answer appears in a very different material form: a bath. The private thermal complex reported from Regio V featured hot, warm, and cold rooms. It was decorated with mosaics, and it has been described cautiously as perhaps one of the largest thermal complexes known from a private house in Pompeii. This cautious phrasing matters. It does not mean private baths were normal in Pompeian homes, nor does it turn one elite house into a model for the whole city. But
it does show what could happen at the upper edge of domestic life, where wealth, hospitality, technology, and social display came together. A bath inside a private house is not only a sign of comfort, it is an installation that demands infrastructure. Heat has to be produced, water must be managed, and surfaces have to be maintained. The body is cared for through architecture, fuel, labor, and design. Seen from the surface, the bath may look like luxury. Seen archaeologically, it becomes a working system. The hot, warm, and cold rooms are not just names for stages of bathing. They point to a household capable of organizing heat, water, decoration, and access. They also point to the people whose labor made elite comfort possible, even when their names do not survive on the walls. The same complex included the Black Room, an elaborate dining space. That pairing matters. Bathing and banqueting could be linked in elite hospitality. A guest might be received not only with food or conversation, but through a controlled experience of comfort, display, and refinement. Pompeii begins to sharpen the picture of Roman life here, not by showing beautiful houses alone, but by exposing some of the machinery behind that beauty. The systems of work, status, and maintenance that made elite domestic life possible. But if the investigation stayed inside this kind of house, it would distort the city. Elite interiors are seductive. They photograph well, survive in color, and can make Roman life look polished and controlled. Pompeii, however, also preserves counters, jars, shops, and food service spaces that pull the story back out into the street. At the Thermopolium of Regio V, large dolia were set into a masonry counter. Hot food and drink could be served from this kind of space. The counter itself was decorated, and the site belongs to a broader pattern. Pompeii had many such thermopolia. It is tempting to call this Roman fast food, but that phrase can flatten what the evidence actually shows. A thermopolium was not a modern restaurant in ancient costume. It was a food service setting embedded in the daily life of a Roman town, bringing a very different kind of evidence into view. Not the staged reception rooms of an elite domus, but the practical architecture of eating, drinking, selling, and moving through urban space. The counter matters because it was built for repeated use. The dolia matter because they held what could be served, stored, or prepared. The painted decoration matters because even practical commercial spaces could be visually marked and made attractive. Once the counter enters the evidence chain, the city is no longer seen only through its houses. It has to be followed through repeated acts of serving, storing, buying, and eating. A person did not have to enter an elite dining room to encounter Roman food culture. Food and drink were also sold at counters, handled in vessels, consumed in passing, and tied to the rhythms of the street. This evidence moves us away from a Roman world made only of atria and frescoes, and toward a city of small businesses, practical exchanges, and daily routines. But counters and vessels only take us so far. They show where things happened, but they do not always show what passed through them, what people ate, how animals were managed, or how plants moved through the broader food system. For that, archaeology has to work with smaller traces. Some of the most revealing evidence from Pompeii is not dramatic at all. It might be plant remains, animal remains, or chemical signals, materials that require extensive laboratory work before they can speak clearly. Stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of plant and animal remains has been used to investigate food resources, agriculture, animal management, and dietary complexity in first-century Pompeii. that kind of evidence does not give us a perfect menu. It cannot reconstruct every meal or tell us exactly what an individual person ate on a particular day. Its strength is different. It lets archaeologists ask questions that a wall painting cannot answer. What kinds of resources were present? How were plants and animals part of the food system? What can the surviving organic remains suggest about cultivation, management, fishing, or diet? This is one reason Pompeii keeps changing. New discoveries matter, but so do new questions asked of old categories of material. A charred seed, an animal bone, a residue, a pigment particle, or a sample taken from a wall can change the entire scale of the investigation. The famous preservation of Pompeii invites the eye. It gives us streets, rooms, doors, colors, counters, and walls. But archaeology does not stop with what the eye can immediately recognize. It moves from visible surfaces into materials, from objects into processes, and from beautiful rooms into the routines that made them work. Once the evidence moves from rooms to materials, the blue room changes shape too. It is no longer only a striking interior. Its color, niches, figures, and surfaces become evidence in their own right. At first, it appears to be a domestic shrine, with its blue walls, red niches, female figures, and carefully crafted interior. It seems to offer one of those intimate glimpses that make Pompeii so compelling. But even here, the evidence asks for caution. A domestic ritual space shows that religion was not only something done at public temples or civic ceremonies. It could belong inside the household, in rooms and niches, in repeated gestures and material arrangements. The blue room can be interpreted as a sacrarium, a domestic sacred space. Its decoration, niches, and placement within a private domus all help support that interpretation. But it does not give direct access to private emotion. It does not allow us to say exactly what the owner believed, or what each person in the household felt when they entered the room. Archaeology can show a space shaped for ritual. It can show pigments, niches, figures, vessels, and context, but it cannot turn those traces into a diary. The room opens Roman household religion, not as an abstract category, but as something made in plaster, pigment, architecture, and use. It shows that daily life and ritual life were not always separate worlds. The same house that could display wealth, entertain guests, store materials, and support bathing could also hold a sacred interior. And then, the floor interrupts the picture. The blue room was not simply sealed and left untouched until modern archaeologists arrived. Bourbon-period tunnels breached the room and damaged its mosaic floor. That detail changes the way the evidence has to be read. Some material may have been displaced, and some objects may have been removed. The absence of something cannot automatically be treated as meaningful if the context was disturbed. This is where the phrase "frozen in time" becomes most fragile. Pompeii was buried in 79 CE, but burial did not create a perfectly untouched city. Some parts were extraordinarily preserved, while others were later entered. Some contexts were damaged by tunneling, and in other areas, evidence suggests people returned after the eruption to live precariously among the ruins. At the Insula Meridionalis, new traces have been interpreted as evidence for post-79 activity. The picture is not of Pompeii restored as a normal Roman city. It is more limited and more unstable than that. People using exposed upper floors, adapting damaged spaces, and establishing hearths, ovens, and mills in a changed landscape. That kind of evidence does not make Pompeii any less important. Instead, it makes the site more archaeological. A perfectly frozen city would be easier to describe, but less honest. The real Pompeii is a record formed by catastrophe, survival, disturbance, excavation, conservation, and reanalysis. It preserves a moment, but it also preserves what happened to that moment afterward. For the viewer, this changes the emotional shape of the site. Pompeii is often powerful because it seems so immediate. A counter looks as if someone has just stepped away. A room seems waiting. A vessel appears abandoned. But archaeology has to ask whether the object is where it was used, where it was stored, where it was moved, or where later activity left it. The answer is not always simple, and that uncertainty is part of the work. The same caution applies to scientific methods. Pigment analysis of the Blue Room did not simply confirm that the walls looked blue. It identified Egyptian blue, allowing researchers to think about the scale and cost of that material choice. Imaging, microscopy, Raman spectroscopy, and other methods made the pigment part of the historical evidence. The blue wall became more than color. It became a trace of material economy, artistic practice, technical knowledge, and domestic display. The isotope work on plant and animal remains does something similar at a different scale. It takes evidence that might look humble beside a fresco or mosaic and uses it to ask about food systems and lifeways. It also shows the limits of interpretation. A method can expand what we know while still leaving boundaries around what can be claimed. So Pompeii is still changing, but not because every season produces a discovery that overturns history. Its importance lies in the way a famous site can yield new meaning when rooms are excavated carefully, old assumptions are tested, small traces are analyzed, and disturbance is treated as part of the record rather than an inconvenience.
The Regio IX Domus does not stand for all Pompeians. It was an elite environment, and it has to be understood as such. The Thermopolium of Regio V does not tell us everything about food in the city. Isotopes do not reconstruct every meal. The Blue Room does not reveal the inner life of every person who entered it. Post-eruption activity does not mean Pompeii continued as a normal city. But together, these traces sharpen the old image of Pompeii. The house gives us display, service, comfort, ritual, and work in the same domestic frame. The bath reveals the infrastructure behind refinement. The counter brings urban exchange into view. Organic remains open questions about food systems. The shrine ties belief to plaster, pigment, and architecture. The tunnel through the floor reminds us that preservation has a history of its own.
Pompeii is still famous because disaster preserved it. Its deeper value is that preservation did not finish the work. The ancient city survives in walls, vessels, pigments, counters, rooms, floors, samples, and damaged layers. Some of those traces are spectacular. Some are nearly invisible. Some were disturbed. Some were only recently exposed. Some have been known for years, but can now be asked different questions. What they offer is not a complete picture of Roman life. No single site can do that. They offer something more useful, a way to see Roman life through the evidence that remains, and to understand why even the most familiar ancient places are not closed. Pompeii was buried in a day, but archaeologically, it is still unfolding.